Well, good evening, everyone. We are going to begin. I'd like to introduce our music student, Taylor Frost, for his good prelude music this evening. Well, this is an Arctic, chilly day today, and perhaps that's fitting as we gather to honor a guy who has spent a lot of time researching Arctic security issues. Welcome to Conrad Grebel University College. I am Susan Schultz-Huxman, president of Conrad Grebel, and we are really delighted that you are here. This is an excellent turnout. The deep freeze temperatures didn't turn too many of you away. And I think, too, I want to say I'm glad you found your way here amidst a very active construction site. Before turning our program over to Fraser Easton, who is chair of the English department at the University of Waterloo, I want to say that we are very pleased to be co-hosting the University of Waterloo Faculty of Arts Alumni Recognition Awards for at least 3 reasons. First, we are celebrating 50 years at Conrad Grebel, and Ernie Regehr was one of our very first students here 50 years ago today. Back then, in 1963, 1964, there were 2 professors and 24 students. Today, we have 14 full-time faculty, 35 part-time faculty, 300 students who relate to student services, and we teach 4,200 students a year through the Faculty of Arts in Waterloo. We are thankful for this precipitous growth and enhanced profile over the past 50 years. Second, we are pleased to be co-hosting this event because Ernie has provided leadership to this college over the years. First, as the founding director of Project Plowshares, which has been housed here beginning in the 1970s, and he gave vibrancy to our first in Canada Peace and Conflict Studies undergraduate program. Then he served us as interim president, and today he continues to consult with us as a senior fellow with the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. From Ernie's early association with PAX, Peace and Conflict Studies, PAX as we call it, in the 70s, our PAX program has grown to produce 4 streams. 1,700 students are enrolled in our undergraduate PAX program. 35 students are enrolled in our new MPAX, our Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies program. Our continuing education Peace and Conflict Studies certificate program conducts 35 to 40 workshops every year with enrollments of over 500. And later this summer, we open the Mennonite Savings and Credit Union Center for Peace Advancement on the 4th floor of this new academic expansion project. And given events around the globe, peace education has never been more in demand. And Project Plowshares, the peace NGO that Ernie first steered, will be coming back home to this space on the 4th floor after over a decade in absence. And John Siebert is here tonight, who is the current Project Plowshares director. We are glad you are returning to Conrad Grebel, John. Finally, we are glad to be co-hosting this event as a way to express our gratitude for the partnership with the University of Waterloo over these past 50 years. What a genius academic model, where students such as Ernie don't have to decide, do I want to go to the flagship research university or the small liberal arts college experience? It's an innovative both-and arrangement that has served us well in attracting top-notch students and top-notch faculty. Thank you, Ernie, for choosing to attend Grebel in your first year that we opened for business. And thank you for providing leadership to the college over the many years to keep us in business. And now, to give Ernie a proper introduction and to put the occasion into context, I call to the podium Professor Fraser Easton, Chair of the English Department at the University of Waterloo. Fraser.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be here on behalf of the Dean of Arts, Douglas Pierce, and the Faculty of Arts, and to welcome you all. The Arts Alumni Achievement Awards were created in 1998 to help establish a tangible form of recognition for alumni who achieved a notable level of success since graduation. Alumni distinguish themselves through a significant record of professional accomplishment, community service, public service, and other activities. The recipients are presented with their award at the fall convocation, as Ernie was, and a special dinner in their honor is held the evening before convocation. We often have the award winners give a talk. In this case, we were happy to delay or defer that talk to this occasion. Well, it gives me great pleasure to provide an introduction to Mr. Ernie Regehr. We're here to recognize him as the 2013 Arts Alumni Achievement Award winner, and please join me in doing so. Ernie is a graduate of the University of Waterloo English Department, graduating in, I guess it's no secret now, 1968. And that was quite a year for English graduates at the University of Waterloo, many of whom, it turns out, were associated with Conrad Grebel. Gordon Campbell graduated that year. You may or may not have heard of Gordon Campbell, but he was a distinguished professor, now retired, of Milton at the University of Leicester in England for many, many years. Most recently author of a volume on the history of the King James Bible as literature. Also graduated that year, 1968, was Mr. J. Dolmage's father. J. Dolmage, Dr. Dolmage now, is one of my colleagues in the English department at the University of Waterloo. His father went to the University of Waterloo. Jay thought his dad graduated in psychology or something. We had a 50th anniversary of the English department, discovered that his father graduated in 1968 in English from Conrad Grebel. And finally, another prominent alumnus from that year is Eric Friesen, the broadcaster, the former CBC broadcaster, now working out in Winnipeg. Now, I'm very happy to say that both Eric and Ernie have helped their former department thrive by serving on the English Advisory Council to the department. And it's because of that that I've been able to ask Eric Friesen if he had anything he could tell me about Ernie's time at Conrad Grebel. And indeed, a master raconteur like Eric has given me a wonderful anecdote to share with you. Perhaps the one thing that very few people know, writes Eric, is that before Ernie became one of North America's most prominent peacemakers, he was an accomplished accountant. So much so that when he came to Conrad Grebel College as a somewhat mature student, he was immediately put to work as the college accountant. This accountancy position, though, conflicted with Ernie's schoolwork, or perhaps to be more honest, his love life with what was then just his girlfriend, Nancy Williams, who would later become his wife. So comes the first Christmas break. Year one, in Ernie's time at UW, he's been hitting the books and keeping some time for dear Nancy. He has to finish the financial bookkeeping for Grebel before heading off home to Edmonton for Christmas. To say he cooked the books is probably overstating things. But let's say he did a rush job and delivered them to the board chair in somewhat, could we say, slapdash fashion. As I recall, the board chair at the time was not amused. And when Ernie returned from his Christmas break, he found that the sheep dung had really hit the fan. So he quickly made amends, and am happy to say he never cut corners in the service of peacemaking. So thanks to Eric Friesen for providing me with that little glimpse back to the past here at Grebel. Now, on a more serious note, Ernie has spent the better part of his life in the pursuit of the demilitarization of security, establishing one of Canada's premier peace and security non-governmental organizations. He is a senior fellow in Arctic security at the Simons Foundation of Vancouver, and a research fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, right here at Conrad Grebel University College. He is also a co-founder of Project Plowshares, an NGO that works with churches, governments, and civil society in Canada and abroad on peace and security issues. Ernie has served as an NGO representative and expert advisor on numerous Government of Canada delegations to multilateral disarmament forums. He has traveled frequently to conflict zones, especially in East Africa, and is on the board of directors of the Africa Peace Forum in Nairobi, Kenya. He's published widely on peace and security in 2000, and in 2003, he became an officer of the Order of Canada. Ernie is the recipient of many other awards and honors, among which it's worth mentioning the Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal and the Honorary Doctor of Laws that he received in 1990 from Wilfrid Laurier University, and I think more importantly and more recently, the Pearson Peace Prize. In this lecture, Limits to Force, Why Contemporary Wars Are Rarely Won, Mr. Regehr explores fundamental questions about contemporary war, the limited utility of military force, and the implications for national and international security policies. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome for Ernie Regehr.
Good. Thank you, Fraser. That was mostly generous. I think at the start I should, given Eric's story, I should assure my kids who are here that it's their mothers who, it's their mother who keeps the family finances. So you don't need to worry so much. Thank you so much to both Fraser and Susan. It's a huge honor to be here and to be recipients of that award. Two wonderful institutions, the extraordinary university that the University of Waterloo has become. Conrad Grebel, as Susan has said, a long time connection. So to be honored by these two institutions is wonderful, means a lot, and I thank you very much, and I thank all of you for being here tonight. I'm not going to be showing you a lot of pictures tonight. In fact, it's only these that are on the screen. But I wanted to refer to them briefly, just describe them briefly, because they refer to each one of those pictures refers to a different type of war, and I'm going to be referring to those war types during the course of the evening. So on the upper right, or just below the limits to force, is you see there a group of guerrilla fighters of the New People's Army in the Philippines. They're in a long-term rebellion against the government, and they are fighting what we call a state-control war. It's a rebellion against the state, and they're fighting to overthrow it and to take control themselves. I'm not quite sure where the location of this particular scene, but I saw a very similar scene to this by the same guerrilla group in passing along the edge of a community in the Cordillera region, which is the northern Luzon area of the Philippines, on a visit there quite some time ago. In the lower left, you'll see Thai police investigating a car bomb in southern Thailand. And that's where a Malay Muslim separatist group is fighting for greater autonomy or secession from Thailand, and making that a state formation war, where the objective isn't to overthrow the government, but the objective is to change the form of the state, the nature of the state. Upper left is a Turkana herdsman with his AK-47 watching his cattle. You see the AK-47 is a little bit in the shadows there, but he carries a weapon because of regular clashes with other pastoralist groups over access to pastured water. There are no state institutions in that area capable of maintaining order or mediating disputes in these remote areas, and hence we've called these types of conflicts failed state conflicts. And this photo was taken in Kenya, and I've seen similar scenes, and I think John and Ken have been in that area, seen similar scenes of herdsmen there and in South Sudan, protecting their herds with arms. All three of these wars are civil wars. The aircraft that you see there is a NATO fighter bomber taking off from Italy and headed for a bombing raid in Libya in 2011. The Libyan war was and is a state-controlled war, also a civil war, but with an episode of massive multilateral intervention. And the lower right shows an Eritrea-Ethiopia tank battle, which took place in 1999 at exactly the same time that NATO was bombing Serbia over Kosovo. This is one of the very few recent interstate wars between states. A few years after this event, I visited the town of Salambesa, which is along the disputed border between Eritrea and Ethiopia, a place where peacekeepers at that time were monitoring a ceasefire. It's an area of extraordinary beauty, although really quite desolate, and didn't seem like a land worth fighting over, but of course it means something very different to local people and to their governments than it does to the casual visitor. Well, as I say, I'm going to refer to these types of wars again. Almost 20 years ago, I was traveling with a group of a half dozen civil society representatives in what was then the chronically war-torn southern Sudan. We visited a training camp of the SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Army. The SPLA was then a decade into its renewed war against Khartoum rule, and we were invited to observe some new recruits going through training drills. To the outsider, it was not an inspiring sight. A few of the recruits wore hand boots. Many of them, more of them, wore flip-flops. The rest were barefoot. Some carried the ubiquitous AK-47 assault rifle. Some had ancient single-shot Winchester rifles, and some were without any weapons at all. None wore uniforms, though some had camouflage trousers. The Sudanese government forces outmatched the southern rebels by every measure. More fighters, more training, more guns, much better transportation and communication, and a lot more money. The government had aircraft and tanks and willing suppliers to provide more. The SPLA made do with their few AKs and a few anti-aircraft guns, fewer artillery pieces, and the occasional tank that they managed to capture from government forces. Throughout, the long-suffering people of southern Sudan had to endure the relentless bombing raids of Khartoum's Antonov bombers, which by then had displaced some 2/3 of the population of the south. Despondent tribal and community leaders in the south, and I met many of them on multiple visits, remained unshakable in their loyalty to the rebel cause, but they were asking with increasing weariness when the promised liberation would finally come. And as if those weren't challenges enough for the ill-equipped and poorly fed cadres of the SPLA, they were also fighting against other Southerners. Some had split from their movement, in many ways it's the same basic split that is at the core of today's crisis in South Sudan, and others simply mounted opportunistic freelance militias to gather the meager spoils of war in their desperately impoverished and ungoverned territories. The situation seemed to us onlookers to define hopelessness. Part of the reason we had arranged to visit that camp was the word that the SPLA commander-in-chief was visiting, and he told us that all was going well, that the young men out in that field, some of them were just boys, would soon be joining a team of dedicated freedom fighters who were making steady progress against a corrupt and weakening government. But his well-rehearsed lines served only to heighten the sense of unreality. Well, the commander's name was Salva Kiir Mayardit, and today he is president of the Independent Republic of South Sudan. So all the vaunted military advantages held by Khartoum ultimately proved irrelevant. From 1956 to 2006, with only a brief interlude of fragile peace along the way, the government of Sudan fought with all the considerable weapons and political wiles at its disposal. Lost my spot. And they were fighting hard to keep the South from separating. No material or human costs were spared, but what the government of the North got in return was a separated South, a shattered economy, and a whole new set of debilitating oil and border quarrels with the new Republic of South Sudan. Burdened by a combination of hubris and denial, an affliction common enough among dictators with big armies, not to mention some elected presidents, President Omar Hassan al-Bashir of the Republic of Sudan, the North, remains defiant. And not long ago, he was still vowing to teach President Kiir and the South Sudanese what he called a final lesson by force over unresolved border disputes between them. Well, there surely are lessons to be drawn from the resort to force in Sudan, but not the one its beleaguered president is still constructing. Nor is Sudan the only source for the hard lessons of contemporary warfare. The inescapable lesson of today's wars, repeatedly taught but hard to learn, is that superior military force rarely prevails when deeply rooted political conflicts turn violent. Indeed, the lesson is more dramatic than that. The noted British military commander, commander of a variety of collective security operations, the late General Sir Rupert Smith, described post-war, Cold War military actions as a succession of campaigns, and I'm quoting now, that have in one way or another spectacularly failed to achieve the results intended, namely a decisive military victory, which would in turn deliver a solution to the original problem, which is usually political. End of quote. From Sudan to the Philippines to Afghanistan to Syria, today's wars are rarely won. They are most often fought to deeply hurting stalemates. Eventually, all sides reluctantly agree that there is no military solution to the conflict, but by then the sacrifices have been so great, and the hatreds and mistrust so entrenched, that political solutions seem even more remote. So the fighting drags on. Contemporary war, in other words, isn't working. Of course, that's just the kind of thing you'd expect a nice Mennonite peacenik to say at a nice Mennonite college. It's great to be able to quote a respected military general saying essentially the same thing about the futility of modern warfare. But is it true? Is it a claim based simply on anti-war sentiment, or is it supported by more than anecdotal evidence? Well, I'm suggesting that we need to pay attention to the evidence available from the last 25 years of conflict. And I wanted to do that in three parts. First, some additional background on contemporary wars, how they're defined and counted, how they begin. Second, I'll look at the important evidence about how these wars end. And finally, I'll look at some policy implications for how we pursue war prevention, and in particular, look at the role of international security and peacekeeping forces in war termination and war prevention efforts. A word about the data. Since 1987, Project Plowshares has been tracking contemporary wars and now has a rich armed conflicts database. And it's on that database that I'm going to be relying, but don't blame them for the results. But check out the Armed Conflicts Report and section of the website of Project Plowshares. There are other sources, like the excellent Human Security Report out of Simon Fraser University, which draws on the conflict data program of Uppsala University in Sweden. So the 23 countries highlighted on this map are the locations of today's 26 ongoing wars. All of today's wars are intra-state or civil wars. There are currently no interstate or wars between states. There are more wars than there are countries on that map. That's because in two of them there are multiple wars. There are 3 in India and 2 in the Philippines. And that begs the question of just how war is being defined. Some of the countries on this map will not be a surprise to you: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia. But others may make you wonder. We can't rely on official declarations to tell us when a country is at war and when to put it on the map. Civil wars are not announced. There are no bugles, no marching bands to start them off. And they usually don't proceed from any conscious decision to go to war. And because fighting is frequently isolated to particular regions within a country and is often sporadic, the metropolitan or central areas often see little overt evidence of war. So to count and track these modern wars, you need a set of reasonably objective and measurable criteria for determining when a country has entered into a state of war or armed conflict and when those wars end. The criteria used by researchers vary in some details, but there's a lot in common, and they're quite straightforward, and these essentially focus on politically motivated conflict that reaches a certain threshold of violence. So armed conflicts or wars, as they're accounted here, are defined by these basic criteria. The fighting is political, as I said. Distinction is, it needs to be between criminal violence and political violence. It engages the security forces of a state. And at least 1,000 people, combatants and civilians, have been killed directly by the fighting during the course of the conflict. And 25 or more are killed annually. So if those conditions prevail, it's a war. Death counts are based on public sources, and since much of the violence takes place far from the gaze of the media or the UN or other monitoring agencies, the levels of violence are sure to be understated. But using these criteria, since 1987, there have been 98 wars in 71 countries, including the present 26. That means that more than 1 in 3 countries worldwide has experienced war on its territory at some point in the last 25 years. 1 in 8 countries is currently the location of a civil war. So some examples of current wars. Kenya is on the map, due in part to ongoing clashes among pastoralist groups in largely ungoverned regions like the Turkana in the opening slide, and also because of attacks by Somali-origin Islamist militants. You will remember that September 2013 attack on the shopping center in Westlands district of Nairobi, killing 72 people. Russia is highlighted because of Chechnya, not because of Crimea. The unrest is now really spread, and the unrest around Chechnya has really spread more broadly into the North Caucasus area, where Islamists pursue secession and self-rule. In India, one war is in the northwest related to Kashmir. Another is in the northeast, where multiple rebel groups seek greater autonomy or secession. And the third is a broader Maoist rebellion. And a few years ago, the clashes in these wars were killing close to 1,000 people per year, but the levels have now declined. So that's the basic picture of the last 25 years of war. 98 wars, 6 of which were interstate wars, 92 of which were and are intra-state wars. And some of these latter included major external interventions like the Libya intervention, but also in Serbia regarding Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The question of how and why wars begin is obviously complicated, there being as many particular reasons as there are wars, probably. However, if governments are to develop effective policies and practices for war prevention, they need to be in possession of some reasonably clear means of identifying the conditions under which war is more likely to occur and to persist, as well as the conditions under which the risks of war are significantly reduced. So the interest here is not in the drivers of political conflict, those are myriad, but in the drivers of armed conflict. When is political conflict most likely to morph into armed conflict or violent conflict? The research literature generally points to a framework of elements like these 4 through which to explore the drivers of armed conflict. So the presence of heightened political, economic, and social grievances, reasons for powerful discontent in a country. Violence is more likely to break out if grievances are directly linked to identity, to particular ethnic or religious groups, or to regional competition. Charges of chronic economic deprivation are one thing, but charges that my family or my community are disadvantaged because of the tribe that they belong to or the religion that they belong to, that's quite another more confrontational matter. A third factor is the capacity for violence. And there is a physical element, obviously access to arms, ammunition, equipment, and also a psychological or political element, the willingness of governments to be brutally repressive, or the willingness of opposition groups to go beyond protest to violence. Finally, the perceived absence of alternatives is key. To prevent political conflict from becoming armed conflict depends heavily on the presence of institutions or mechanisms that can serve as trusted mediating vehicles. But when people lose confidence in such institutions, options narrow and violence begins to look inevitable. Once a war has started, once that threshold of political violence has been crossed, how does it end? In mythology, it ends when one side wins, but in reality, as we'll see, it doesn't work that way. Of the 98 wars of the past century, only 6 were interstate wars, and they all ended. And I'll briefly recall them for you. Only one of those wars between states reached a decisive military conclusion. Many of you will remember that initially Iraq attacked and quickly defeated Kuwait in 1990, but a few months later, in early 1991, Iraq was just as decisively expelled from Kuwait by the US-led Desert Storm. In 3 cases, there were negotiated ceasefires, Eritrea and Ethiopia, one of the opening photos. Armenia and Azerbaijan war was negotiated a ceasefire, and Iran, Iraq. And in each case, the fundamental causes of the conflict were utterly unresolved. And 2 interstate wars essentially dissolved. Israel left Lebanon after its attack in 2006. None of its objectives really achieved. And Vietnam also withdrew from Cambodia after a decade-long intervention. But most wars are civil wars. There were 92 of them, and 66 of those ended in the past quarter century. So how did they end? This map is intended to indicate that, but it's a bit hard to take it in quickly. So I'll put out some key numbers instead, a little bit easier to follow. So this summarizes the way in which 66 civil wars ended over the past quarter century. In only 4 cases, 4 out of 66, 6%, did governments actually win and defeat insurgents. That happened in Angola, it happened in Sri Lanka, in Georgia in the early years immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it happened in Iraq in 1991 when Saddam Hussein crushed the Shia revolt, which erupted after Desert Storm. Insurgents were marginally more successful. In 5 cases, 8%, insurgents defeated governments. Ethiopian rebels overthrew the Mengistu regime. After the genocide, Rwandan Tutsi-led forces expelled the Hutu-dominated government. East Timor won independence, although it was the non-violent resistance rather than the guerrilla force that actually made the difference in the end. In Kosovo and Panama, insurgents prevailed, but relied almost entirely on NATO and US forces, respectively, to do so. So overall, only about 14% were decided on the battlefield. Fully 50% ended through negotiations. Years of stalemated fighting, ultimately leading to talks, as they did in Sudan. Of course, it needs to be acknowledged that events on the battlefields inevitably influence negotiations. In fact, for insurgents like the SPLA, the main point of fighting is not really to win, but is to get a seat at a negotiating table. And the remaining 36% dissolved, which can mean a variety of things. It can mean effective police and military attacks that, while they don't defeat the insurgents, persuade them to fade out of sight for a while, perhaps to fight another day. This is applied to the Kurds of Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, whose fights have been on and off affairs over decades. It can mean, and often does, a deliberate change in the opposition tactics in favor of reintegrating into a political process. That was the case in several Indonesian rebellions, and in South Africa, the KwaZulu holdouts, after Mandela's release from prison, also decided to join the political process after a period of violence. It can also mean that governments have taken measures to address grievances, essentially peace-building and local conflict resolution efforts that gradually construct conditions that ease tensions, and that happened, for example, in the land dispute in northern Ghana. The real point is that when government leaders turn to their armies to crush protest and to prevent political change, the odds run overwhelmingly against them. It is in this sense that contemporary warfare doesn't work. The quick military defeats of discredited regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003 by coalition attacks worked very well in regime destruction, but that set the stage for, not for stability and prosperity, but for civil wars that more than a decade later show signs of continuing indefinitely. Other armed conflicts that don't often make the news, notably long-running wars like those in the Philippines, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Thailand, or other Kurdish territory, or the Kurdish territories of the Near East. These remain stalemated and incapable of settling anything. And if we look at current trends in the types of war being fought, we'll have to conclude that prospects for what Rupert Smith called decisive military victories that deliver a political solution are unlikely to improve. I referred earlier to these basic types. In state control wars, just to review, wars, the fight is to gain control of a state. In state formation wars, the primary objective is either to change the shape of the state through secession or greater autonomy or self-rule for particular regions. Failed state wars are typically over local issues that state institutions or security forces are unable to manage. And a fourth and growing category of contemporary war is a kind of hybrid of multiple types of war in a single country. So now let's look at how each of these types of war tends to end. State control and state formation wars at the top there are wars are most likely to end through negotiations. These are conflicts fought over quite clearly defined objectives, and they tend to be led by recognized leaders. So the negotiating issues are clearer, and there are recognized rebel authorities with whom to negotiate. But in the combined categories of failed state and hybrid wars on lower, far fewer, only 15%, end through negotiations. And that's largely because the objectives in these hybrid situations are much less well-defined, and the rebel element is much more fractured, making it harder to find either negotiating points or the right people with whom to negotiate. And notably, these kinds of wars, these failed state and hybrid wars, are never settled on the battlefield. Superior military force is of little consequence here. Instead, the overwhelming majority, some 85%, are dissolved, and by a variety of means. And now we're looking at today's war types. It turns out that proportionately more of these wars are of the latter type, failed state and hybrid. In the past quarter century, they were just under 30% were of failed state and hybrid wars, but today, shown here in yellow, close to 50% are. In other words, half of today's wars are the types that are never won militarily. So the policy implications are really not hard to discern. To end the kinds of wars that are never settled militarily, the focus has to be not on building up military capacity, but on the social, political, and economic measures that address the four basic drivers of conflict, that address grievances, that respond to identity issues, that try to restrain capacity for violence, and that provide alternatives to violence. That's another way of saying that the foundations of security are obviously multi-dimensional. Security forces continue to be relevant for the pursuit of peace, order, and good governance, but they are not going to win peace on the battlefield. So the multi-dimensional foundations of peace and security need to be acknowledged in policy. And here are 5 such dimensions that we can think of them as the 5 Ds of security, 5 areas of programming essential to war prevention. And they're all fairly self-evident. Development, building the kinds of economic, social, and environmental conditions that genuinely address grievances. Democracy, promoting good governance and political inclusion and respect for human rights, and building institutions and mechanisms that can mediate political conflict and earn the trust and loyalty of the people, creating credible alternatives to violence and alternative means of settling disputes. Disarmament, obviously limiting access to arms by non-state groups and preventing repressive and destabilizing accumulations of arms by states. Diplomacy, reconciliation all the way from local community and identity rivalries to multilateral efforts toward the peaceful management of political conflict. And defense, enforcement of the rule of law and protection of national institutions. In societies facing instability, the temptation is to focus the primary attention on this last D. But an inescapable conclusion from the past 25 years of warfare is that countries that succumb to that temptation don't get good value for their security dollar. It's a hard reality that when the resort to force is not solving a conflict, the resort to still more force probably won't either. Furthermore, focus on the defense D leads to underfunding of the other 4 Ds. These are the lessons of contemporary war, and they point to the need to shift priorities within that 5D security envelope. But I'm afraid we're still hobbled by what Lester B. Pearson called a grim fact, namely that we prepare for war like precocious giants and for peace like retarded pygmies. Our sense of political correctness in language has improved since his day. But his essential point is as true today as it was in 1957 when he gave his Nobel lecture. I did say that security forces continue to be relevant in the pursuit of peace, order, and good governance. The rule of law needs to be buttressed by enforcement. Populations in peril need protection. And people in countries emerging from armed conflict need assurances that governments have both the will and the capacity and international help when needed to credibly assure citizens that a lawful order is in the process of being established. International peacekeeping and peace support forces are regularly called upon for such assistance. Currently, the UN operates some 25 peacekeeping missions worldwide that employ just over 80,000 military peacekeepers and 15,000 police officers. And to its credit, the UN Peacekeeping Office has, over its 60-plus years of experience, developed a set of principles and guidelines to place real constraints on the resort to force. And peacekeeping nowadays doesn't mean just unarmed blue helmets with binoculars. There's varieties of robustness, to use a euphemism, in that peacekeeping forces have to engage in. In particular, the UN's guidance document makes a distinction between peace support and warfighting operations. And the key difference is that peace support operations are based on strategic consent, and I'll come back to that, and are designed to facilitate political process to pursue resolution of conflict. Warfighting, on the other hand, is pursued in the absence of strategic consent and is designed not to facilitate political process, but to override politics by dint of force in the hope of imposing political solutions. In concluding, I want to illustrate that distinction between peace support and warfighting operations by taking just a bit more time to consider the case of Afghanistan. The Canadian military mission has just ended, though the war certainly has not. And so I thought I would look at how these basic principles were followed or not followed in Afghanistan. First, remember the context. When we ask whether anything constructive was accomplished in Afghanistan by the international military presence, we need to acknowledge what had gone on before. In the 1980s, Afghanistan endured the extraordinarily brutal Soviet invasion. Estimates of Afghan war dead in that decade ranged from 850,000 to 1.5 million. In the first half of the 1990s, after the Soviets had finally left, rival factions and militias fought for control. The Taliban were not yet a factor. The war-related deaths were measured in the tens of thousands annually during that first part of the 1990s, peaking in 93, 94. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Afghanistan was the world's primary producer of refugees. The Taliban emerged from that chaos, welcomed by many as a more disciplined presence. And in the second half of the 1990s, they fought their way to control, and then to stay in control. Warfare all the way along, never a period of peace there. The annual civilian death toll was still in the many thousands during the Taliban rule and fight to stay in. Then came 9/11 and the US-led attack. Whatever one's attitudes toward that attack, and some of us opposed it vigorously, The defeat of the Taliban came quickly. That was immediately followed by the Bonn peace process, which established a transitional government, and a successor government was later confirmed by elections. The level of violence in early 2002 and in 2003 was dramatically lower than it had been, lower than at any time in the 2 decades before. The International Security Assistance Force, I'll call it ISAF, was immediately authorized by the UN and thus established, with contributions from 40 countries, to support the new government. And it was intended as a peace support operation. And peace support operations, as distinct from warfighting operations, are designed to operate under these basic conditions. First is strategic consent, a broad consensus in support of a foreign presence, military and non-military, and the purpose of that presence being to support a ceasefire or a peace agreement in the country. Legitimacy, the new order that the external forces are supporting and defending, has legitimacy amongst the population, sometimes reinforced by elections. The restrained use of force. Foreign forces are there for constabulary actions against spoilers, not military attacks on enemies. Support of the region, since neighbors can easily destabilize internal situations, their consent is critical. Evidence of lives improving is critical. Economic improvement, respect for human rights, and so on, all essential to maintaining strategic consent and legitimacy. Well, in 2002 and 2003, the presence of international forces in Afghanistan seemed to adhere broadly to these conditions. Strategic consent had been arrived at through a formal peace agreement. There was considerable support and hope for the new government. There were certainly pockets of resistance, as there inevitably are, though not from the Taliban at that time. They were assumed then to be gone for good. But from other spoilers and local militias and warlords who were reluctant to disarm and disband. The new regime, as a result, had a measure of legitimacy. The resort to force by ISAF was restrained and essentially confined to policing operations in Kabul. Canada was the leader of that for a time, although the U.S. was still operating independently in other parts of the country. Active destabilization from regional neighbors like Pakistan was not yet apparent, and certainly some Afghans felt their lives were improving or about to improve. New freedoms, opportunities for women, especially in urban areas, and relief at the reduced levels of violence. So that was the situation in that period of the lowest level of conflict. The Achilles heel was that the Bonn peace agreement had not included the Taliban. They weren't part of the strategic consent, and everybody thought they were done and gone. And it soon became clear they were not gone. The Taliban, and I'm using that term roughly as a synonym for insurgents, though not all insurgents in Afghanistan were or are under the formal Taliban control. The insurgents had regrouped and had areas of internal support, and especially regional support now from Pakistan. They had become more than spoilers. In 2004 and 2006 period, they made their presence increasingly felt, and ISAF pushed back. In 2006, Canada led ISAF's move into the Taliban's stronghold of Kandahar, and other nations also moved aggressively into additional areas of the south. In the process, ISAF's engagement of spoilers was transformed into major combat operations against the Taliban. In other words, ISAF was no longer a multilateral peace support force operating under strategic consent in a constabulary role against spoilers. It had, with Canadian forces as part of it, moved into direct combat on one side of a civil war. And here's the key point. As a long history of UN experience has made clear, when strategic consent evaporates, it can't be recovered by force. Recovering strategic consent needs a comprehensive political process. When strategic consent is gone, the effort to restore it through force is the effort to win a civil war. And as we've seen, the odds are overwhelmingly against that working. Remembering that in the last 25 years, in only 6% of cases, did governments defeat insurgents militarily. Like President Bashir of Sudan, NATO, which then led ISAF, was burdened by the same combination of hubris and denial. And it too was convinced that it would teach the Taliban a final lesson by force, ignoring the lessons of the past 25 years of warfare. Recovering strategic consent requires negotiating, but you'll remember how calls for political process to renegotiate the Bonn agreements were ridiculed when Jack Layton joined the many in the development and peace-building communities who said that the way to end war is to negotiate their end. The government responded only with taunts about Taliban Jack and declarations that we don't negotiate with terrorists. All the while, things were going wrong for NATO on all of these fronts. Strategic consent was long gone. The international forces were now defending a government which, through a combination of factors, corruption high among them, had lost its legitimacy with the population. International forces became increasingly aggressive in trying to win the war, relying heavily on aerial bombing and house searches, and it showed in rising civilian deaths and rising resentment. In 2007, the top line there, was the year that the UN started tracking annual civilian combat deaths. You'll see that pro-government forces, PGF forces, AGF is anti-government forces, you see that pro-government forces killed almost as many civilians as did the anti-government forces. Regional support went strongly to the insurgents by virtue of Pakistan's support for the Taliban, and the lives of Afghans were not improving. In 2008, I visited Kabul, the first of 3 visits, and on my very first evening there, I was taken to a high school to meet some senior-level male students from around the country who were in Kabul temporarily studying English in anticipation of competing for university spots in India. The idea was that I would get an unvarnished view of people from all parts of the country, and the students would get to practice their English. So with the help of an additional interpreter for me, they started to talk, and they didn't hold back. One young chap more or less summed it up when he said 40 of the world's largest armies and richest countries, the ISAF countries, have come to little Afghanistan. They brought their soldiers and tanks and fighter aircraft and their large aid budgets. But year by year, the Taliban gets stronger. Our relatives are killed by NATO bombs, and we get poorer. Why? Well, I was actually saved from responding to that when the power went out. The crowded dormitory room we were in went pitch black. And I have to say that certain thoughts ran through my mind when I realized that here I was, identified as a Western Christian from a NATO country, in a dark room in Kabul, jammed full with about 35 very angry, very agitated young Muslim men, all of a prime fighting age. But the candles were soon lit, and they continued to be gracious hosts. But it's an understatement to say that there was no confidence in that room that much good would come from the international military presence among them. They didn't talk about the loss of strategic consent, but they identified all the conditions that had changed the foreign presence from a peace support operation into a losing war-fighting operation. Well, it's clear that we'll continue to hear of wars and rumors of wars, But war is not endemic to the human condition. The truth is that A, it doesn't work, and B, there are alternatives. And we should be insisting that all the hard-nosed realists in the Defense and Foreign Affairs departments and around cabinet tables should be paying a lot more attention to the evidence and to those two irrefutable realities. Thanks very much.
Well, we've already thanked Ernie for his wonderful talk. There is an opportunity now for questions for our speaker this evening.
Sure.
Yes.
Given the criteria that you just used, how would you define and describe the war on terrorism? Is it really a war, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, by our definition, the way I look, it isn't a war. It is, I mean, terrorism happens in places. When people bomb a shopping center in Westlands of Nairobi, that's terrorism, but it's not but it isn't a distinct war from other places. Terrorism takes place within geography in particular places and so forth. So it's, I mean, war on terrorism, I mean, it's like you can have a war on poverty, and you know, so as a kind of metaphor, you can use it that way. But it isn't. It doesn't function as a war, and you don't respond to. You can't respond to it in that same way. You have to deal with the conditions in the particular countries that is spawning that kind of activity.
Yes.
Ernie, at the political level, there are a number of governments, I'll include, which is not given to paying attention to evidence. I don't, you know, climate change or whatever. But below that, my experience has been, for instance, the defense establishment in the U.S. paid very close attention to the climate data because they needed to adapt to it. Do you have any sense as to whether below the political level there are people in the security establishment who are actually paying attention to the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, part of the place where they pay a lot of attention to the evidence is at the UN and in the UN in the peacekeeping operations there. I mean, that's very deliberate, the way in which they pursue it, and the UN peacekeeping operations involve some combat activities, but they're very careful to make that distinction between peace support and the conditions that need to attend to it and war fighting. And once you get into one side of a civil war, it doesn't work. And so the UN is fairly strict on that and reluctant then to go into those situations in which it's a war. Within national governments, I think that there are some. I mean, in the Nordic governments, for example, I have that's not going to mean a whole lot to you, but it's a graph that shows the ratio of defense spending to ODA spending, and so in that first short line, it means where Sweden, it's 1-to-1. Sweden spends as much on development assistance and all of the things as it does on its military. So Sweden, Ireland, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, all of those countries are pretty close to focusing on the non-military responses to conflict and to conflict prevention. And that, I mean, I think that's a model worth emulating. You've got three guesses about who's at the bottom. Where the United States spends 22 times as much on the military as it does on Canada is in the middle there, about 4 times as much as on. But I think that the countries at the top there have really recognized, I I mean, I think they're looking at the evidence and deciding the way in which we're going to make a difference. And Norway, I think, is a particularly good example of emphasizing diplomacy, targeted development assistance, and so forth, in consciously looking at war prevention and war termination policy by means other than the military one.
Yes. The elephant in the room right now, I think, is what's happening between Russia and in Ukraine. Could you comment a little bit about your perception of what you think is happening there?
Yeah, Ukraine. I mean, it's hard to. Number one, it's not a war. It's not a war, thank goodness. And I think it's unlikely to become a war. Just a little digression. Modern military forces can do extraordinary damage in a very short period of time. Henry Kissinger said about nuclear weapons, which can do, exponentially more damage in a short period of time. I mean, he's become an anti-nuclear guy, and he said that there are you cannot conceive of any foreign policy objectives or national interests which would be warranted by the resort to military force. Well, I think the same really applies to the resort to mechanized conventional war. It's hard to imagine what Ukraine could get from mounting a military defense there, and the military movements that are taking place now, they're just communications mechanisms. You move troops here in order to send a message, and you move. So somebody should tell them about BlackBerry. It's a lot cheaper way to send messages. I think we were talking about it beforehand, and I think one hard reality about the Ukraine is that if Ukraine were a well-run country, it wouldn't be in the trouble that it is today. The best defense against foreign intervention is not a major military, but it means keeping your affairs in order. And if the country was well run, everybody felt they were a part of it, it was inclusive, there'd be no way that you could tolerate. So, I mean, that doesn't say anything about the way in which this is going to end up. But I think I think that's part of the lesson to learn. If you want to defend yourself, be organized and meet all of those conditions about addressing grievances and be politically inclusive and reconciliation between different groups within your country and so forth. I think that's the message.
Yes, sir. If you could put your slide up that had the military expenditures on, I have a question about that.
Yep.
If it's true that nations that are so involved in sponsoring wars are causing this horrific harm long term, can't you make a case from this chart that sanctions should be imposed against the nations that are on the bottom of your chart?
Good luck with that. I think it's true. They're, in a sense, they're the outliers, right? And, yeah. Good idea. I've passed over this. This is just, you might be interested. That's the trend in the number of wars since 1987. So you see that the overall level of warfare is declining. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Steven Pinker, who covers the better angels of our nature, because that is the title of his book, and he covers the entire span of human history and sort of maps the decline of violence over the full span of human history. He says this is the most peaceful time in the human era. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of that book too, about his kind of being a little bit too optimistic, but currently, and I like to think that part of the reason that it's declining is that there's some recognition that it's not working. It's not a way in which you're going to achieve the national, advance the national interest and achieve objectives.
Yes.
Ernie, it's good to be back, and we could share some extra stories with Eric's in terms of the first year. But
Don't bother.
Herbert Smith, great book, Utility of Force. One of the messages from his book that you didn't comment on is the asymmetrical types of war that's going on and the cost of dealing with set-piece battle equipment relative to their benefit to the nation state.
Yeah.
You may want to comment on that in a bit, but my real question was, after returning from Liberia for a couple of trips over there, 2 civil wars that had gone on in the country, from my perspective, one of the keys that prevent war is an improved economy. And after a war, one of the real difficulties is to get the economy back in gear. And for Africa in particular, where war has devastated agricultural bases, the financial institutes, where loans for new equipment for the agricultural base is running at 15, 20, 30%, no property records for supporting bank loans. While war perhaps is a real problem because it provides this huge devastation to the country, and the cost of recovery is huge, the ability to get back to any degree of normalcy is being impaired by the inability to drive the economy. And that's then compounded again, as you point out, by the cycle of armaments and tribal warfare and so forth. Africa, from my perspective, is a major problem. I mean, you've been obviously back there more than anybody. Perhaps you could comment on some of those issues.
Well, I mean, the main comment would be to say a hearty amen. I think those are, and that's part of where we need to change some of those spending priorities. And I know that development assistance is on its own isn't the answer to those problems. There's a whole variety of things, as you know, better than I, that lead to a competent economy. I wanted to just make a comment about the asymmetric nature of the warfare, and that's part of the reasons why you never you can't win a war. If there are 2 armies going at it, and if Eritrea and Ethiopia had said the heck with the cost, we'll just keep fighting each other, they were fighting a conventional war. And if you travel to that area, you see the trench, World War I style trenches that they had built there to fight that war. Sooner or later, one side would have caved probably if they just go on indefinitely. But in the asymmetric wars, it's very difficult. It's impossible. In Afghanistan, the ISAF forces never lost a battle. Every time they engaged with the Taliban, they utterly defeated them, the Taliban. And as one Canadian military officer said, that the Taliban were experts at converting every tactical loss into strategic advantage. And that's essentially what happened there. And it's not unique to the Taliban. That's the way that they all happened. That's what happened with the SPLA. They could never win a battle against the Sudanese forces, but ultimately they prevailed. And that's right. We're preparing for while that's happening you know, building massive aircraft carriers and all the rest of it. Well, and they're extraordinarily expensive, and they're not going to win those conflicts. I think Susan had that. Yeah, please.
I'd like to sneak in two questions if I could. The first is, what are you researching in the Arctic as it relates to security issues? And is it more challenging or is it easier to deal with peace and war in that frozen place? So that's number one. And number two, we have a new master's program here in Peace and Conflict Studies. We're into our second year. If there was one thing that you think our students should emerge from our program either understanding in terms of expertise or in terms of experience, what might that be?
Boy, that's the Arctic first. And the Arctic is a pretty positive place. I mean, it's climate change is opening it up, and unfortunately, it's opening it up to possibly more expropriate, you know, or extraction. That's it of carbon, you know, which is going to accelerate climate change and so forth. So, but from a security point of view, there's a lot of cooperation, and that's one of the reasons I'm very worried about the Crimea and the relations between the West, the rest of the Arctic world, and Russia. And we don't want to get partisan here, but I mean the kind of public hammering away and pointed references to Putin over and over again about him being an old cold warrior is not a good idea. Mr. Harper has to sit down at the Arctic Council table right next to Mr. Putin. And he's got to be able to deal with the events in the Arctic in some reasonable manner. And Putin has been very good in the Arctic, and he's said, as have the others said, that there are no military threats in the Arctic, that none of the disputes in the Arctic are ever going to be settled by military means. We have international law, the law of the sea, all of that's going to apply. So that there's a positive element there in the Arctic, and we oughtn't to let events in other parts of the world undermine that. On the Masters, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's wonderful that John Paul Lederach is going to be the recipient of an honorary degree in honor of that, because he's done such terrific work on diplomacy and reconciliation and mediation. Those are essential things. You know, the lack of alternatives. That's a very critical question. You know, one of the when you think about the Arab Spring, why did Syria and Libya move into war so quickly? Egypt didn't. Well, there are tribal and ethnic identity issues there. I mean, they all had many grievances. But one of the issues in Egypt was that there was always some, through the army and so forth, there's always some avenue for negotiations and for talks. And when you have absolutely intractable situations, that frequently is the one thing that you can fairly quickly insert. That if you provide public resources for dealing with not only the high level, but citizen diplomacy at low levels between tribal or ethnic groups that are suspicious of each other, like in South Sudan right now. So mediation, diplomacy, public diplomacy, I put a pretty high level of emphasis on that. I think that's an important element, but that's not really new. But
now we have a number of hands that have come up, Ernie, excuse me,
That's
and we do have some refreshments that will be coming in a few minutes. So I've seen, I thought I saw a hand over here, so is there, over here?
There's a gentleman right here, and then...
Okay, so I think I've got about
Yeah.
4 hands up. We'll see if we can get through those questions. The first person I saw was over there. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Ernie. Back to Afghanistan. The question I won't ask you is to comment on the hubris within the Canadian military on the recent return and what we're hearing on the media.
Yeah.
The question I will ask you is, what is your sense of where the BSA, Bilateral Security Agreement, is going to go? When I was in Afghanistan last month,
Yeah.
a lot of speculation on that.
Yeah.
What are the end games of both sides, Afghanistan and the USA, on the BSA?
Yeah. Well, I don't really have a handle on that. If you do, if you have some sense of where those talks are, then you should be happy to hear it. I don't have I mean, I think one of the great danger, I mean, if all of the international forces pull out, then I really worry about the replay of the situation in the first half of the 1990s, when the Soviets all pulled out. There was no clear authority within Afghanistan, and the rival groups were really in unrestrained war. I mean, during the entire Soviet war, which was the most horrific, Kabul was largely untouched. But when the Civil War happened, that's when there was huge destruction in Kabul. And so it's, I mean, it's a standard thing that if you've got a big military force and you've got, you always say that, the same as when the Americans left Vietnam, everything was going to implode and it was going to be utter disaster. So we have to be careful of that. But the absence of any effective effort, really, to pursue a diplomatic solution to power sharing in Afghanistan, which there obviously has to be. I mean, very different areas and different ethnic authorities in different parts of the country. To have them all vie for control of Kabul could be a very, very dangerous thing. So for that reason, the way in which that plays itself out is an important thing, but I can't, not close enough to know, of that specific agreement.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I should stop.
I'd like your opinion on how much is the arms industry driving conflict?
Well, we've got a guy sitting in the second row here who's the expert on the arms industry. I'll connect you with him after but I mean, I think it is. I mean, it's obviously an influence. There's a huge body of interest there that wants to keep this thing going, and that wants to sell aircraft carriers and offshore Arctic Patrol and all of those kinds of big ships. So I think that there is it's an important influence, but at the same time, what we need is some political leadership. At the end of the Cold War, when military spending went sharply down, not down far enough for many of us who are never pleased, but went way down. That didn't and the international arms trade, in fact, went in sharp decline during that period of time. It doesn't. It didn't create irrevocable economic hardship. I mean, that's what industry does. It adjusts to changing market conditions. And when political leaders decide we're going to spend a lot less money on arms, Well, they start, it was a boost to the aerospace industry. It was a boost to the civilian aerospace industry when there was a reduced focus on arms. So I think that the arms industry are important. They are lobbyists. They put a lot of money into influencing government, but it takes some political leadership to resist that.
So was there any over here? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Ernie. Can you just comment on the role of nonviolent movements in these kind of conflicts, their potential for efficacy at all?
Yeah, I wish there had been time for that, and it's very important. There's a great couple of books by a woman by the name of Chenoweth. Are you familiar with those? Yeah, and in which I just remember one statistic that from something like 1900 to 2006, the number of successful nonviolent campaigns was much higher than the number of successful military campaigns. So that there is, I think that's another area to be totally mined and explored. That there are tactics and there are strategies that goes into that. It's not just willy-nilly, and I think that's another thing for your curriculum. A great thing to address is what are the conditions under which nonviolence works and how does it work and that sort of thing. But those are two great books, and we'll just take these are young scholars. There's two authors to them, and they're very good. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy who tracked nonviolence for many, many years. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I thought I saw him over here earlier. Well, okay, over to the right, sir. Yes.
Yes, Ernie, thank you for your talk. It was interesting to see that, the evidence that wars are not a way to resolve conflict. It's also interesting to know that upwards of 50% of the world's fossil fuels are used on the war industry on a totally useless thing that is no good for anybody. So one way to dramatically lower the carbon footprint and the impact of climate change is to reduce the war machine and all its machinations. And I'm wondering, are there any people looking at the environmental impact of this industry? Because I know upwards of 50% of the fossil fuels are used. And I know social impacts and building schools versus building aircraft carriers and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm just curious if anybody started to connect the dots and realize that the impact on the world and the survival of the world is hugely impacted by having this industry in place.
Yeah, I think there are, and I haven't looked at that recently, but there are people who study both the impact of the preparation for war, the military industry and so forth, and then also the devastating impact of wars of these kind of long, drawn-out, asymmetric guerrilla wars in which any kind of husbandry of the environment is utterly impossible, impacts on wildlife in Africa and so on. So that there are huge environmental damage there. Really, three elements to that question. One is the environmental costs of preparing for war, the environmental costs of fighting war, and then those researchers who explore means of using the environment as a war fighting tactic. So, yeah, it's an important point.
All right, very, very quickly, yes. Next question.
I just want to ask the opposite climate change question. Do you think that climate change will cause us to see significantly more wars in the coming 10, 20, 50 years than we would otherwise expect?
Well, the Turkana chap there, really, in some ways, fighting an environmental war. I mean, he's fighting with rival pastoralists over very scarce water resources and scarce pasture resources. So, in a sense, that's an environmental war. that is being fought. And so I think that that's, I mean, I don't have a basis of saying how much. Darfur, I think, has elements of that. So I think that there are other places in India and so forth where I'm sure that's a factor. But yeah, that leads to conflict and population movements and so forth.
Thank you, Ernie. I have a few closing remarks. Which is this working? Yeah. Okay, thanks. So the main thing is, in a moment, to direct you up to the where the refreshments will be served in the upper atrium, and apparently the elevator is not working. So if anyone needs assistance getting there, please go over and see Sherry-Ann Arsenault at the back of the room for any help that you might need. And she'll be down at the registration table and she can lead you upstairs. I do have a few thank yous to say. First of all, I'd like to thank Patty Cook and Sherry-Ann Arsenault from the Dean of Arts office for helping prepare for tonight's event. I know who they are. I don't know everyone who I ought to thank, perhaps, here at Conrad Grebel, but let me just do that in a summary fashion by thanking Susan Huxman. This has been a great event. It's been wonderful to help host it here at Conrad Grebel, a great partner with the University of Waterloo, and we're very pleased to have you working with the Faculty of Arts on all the different initiatives that you're doing. And one more thank you, the most important thank you. Just one moment. Ernie. I don't know if I have enough hands to do this properly. But once again, thank you very much for your talk this evening. Thank you. And with that, refreshments will be served upstairs. Thank you.